Good afternoon, and welcome to the At the Races webinar on how the election looks 6 months to go. I'm Herb Jackson. I'm the politics editor at CQ Roll Call, and I'm here with our team, Bridget Bowman, Kate Ackley, and Stephanie Aiken, to talk about the recent updates we made to our lists of the 10 most vulnerable House and Senate members. Then, when we're finished talking about those lists, I'm going to turn things over to Deputy Editor Jason Dick, who is the host of the Political Theater podcast, and he and our elections analyst, Nathan L. Gonzalez, are going to talk about the overall political environment, the presidential race, and the battles for the House and Senate. But first, a plug. You can stay on top of all our coverage by signing up for the At the Races newsletter, which went out about a half hour ago, and for Jason's podcast alerts. Just go to rollcall.com/newsletters and enter your email address. Okay, let's start with the 10 most vulnerable senators. Stephanie, you've been going through this a couple of times. Can you tell us what goes into putting these lists together?
Sure, a lot of conference calls. We spend a lot of time on the phone with the Democratic and Republican committees, with outside groups who are involved really closely with these races, and talk about all of what they're looking at. They make their cases to us about who they think should be on the list. We take that into consideration with everything that we know about the races. We at normal times do spend some time on the ground in these states and districts to get a sense of what's going on there. We also look at polling, and we talk to our on staff race analyst, Nathan Gonzalez, who's going to be on the podcast later, and make our own judgment calls.
Thanks. Okay, and Kate, you're our newsroom expert on campaign finance and lobbying, but you're a relative newcomer to the At the Races team. What struck you as the most difficult part of putting these kind of lists together?
Well, there is an element that's a little bit subjective. I mean, we do a lot of reporting, and you mentioned the campaign finance background. So we look at how much money these candidates have in the bank. That helps us decide, how they're doing, what their strength is in terms of fundraising. But there's just a lot of reporting and a lot of calls and polling and deep background that goes into assessing where these campaigns stand right now.
Okay. And Bridget, this is your second cycle going through this, so I'm sure it's just boring and you don't feel like doing it anymore. But why don't you start us off by telling us which senators were on the list in November and dropped off and why, and then take us through the start of the Senate list, starting with the most vulnerable.
Sure. So as you mentioned, we did a first version of this list 6 months ago to mark a year out from the election. And as we were revisiting all of these races to mark 6 months out, we realized we would have to add some senators, that there were some changes in several races where senators would have to get on the list, which meant we had to take some people off. So some senators who were on our list 6 months ago but dropped off include Republicans David Perdue of Georgia and John Cornyn of Texas. Now, both of them still could have competitive races just given the dynamics of their states, but there are some of their colleagues that are in a little bit more trouble than they are right now. We also saw New Hampshire Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen fall off the list. We originally had her on because of how tight the presidential margin was in New Hampshire in 2016, but she's looking like she's in a strong position. She's fundraising well, and the Republican field is still kind of unclear. Nathan also in his ratings moved the New Hampshire race to solid Democrat, so she is no longer on our list. But to start with who did make the list this time, this is probably no surprise to all of you out there who've been watching these races. Topping the list at number 1, the most vulnerable senator, is Democrat Doug Jones from Alabama. He, of course, won a very close special election in 2017 against a very deeply flawed Republican candidate. And this is Alabama, after all. This is a very Republican state. So Senator Jones is going to need some Republicans to either split their tickets between Trump and him, which seems like a pretty tough, a tall order. It is unclear, though, right now who he's going to face in November. The Republican primary runoff was actually postponed due to the coronavirus pandemic. We saw many states postponing elections amid this health crisis. So the race between former Attorney General Jeff Sessions and former Auburn football coach Tommy Tuberville, who has the president's endorsement, that runoff was pushed to July 14th. So that could help Doug Jones prolonging this Republican fight. But again, it's still Alabama, so it's still going to be a tough race for him, even though he also has a pretty sizable financial advantage. So he stayed at the top of our list. The number 2 senator also stayed the same compared to 6 months ago, and that's Republican Senator Cory Gardner, first elected in 2014. He's one of 2 Republican senators running for re-election in a state that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So already that makes him pretty vulnerable. And Colorado saw the blue wave kind of sweep over the state in 2018. So Democrats are feeling pretty good about this race. They also have former Democratic Governor John Hickenlooper, who you might remember ran for president unsuccessfully. He decided to run for Senate instead. He's raising a good amount of money. He does still have to get through the primary, which is on June 30th. And at number 3, we have Republican Senator Martha Mcsally from Arizona. So she is looking like she's in a pretty tough spot. As some of you might remember, she lost a Senate race in 2018, a very close race. She was appointed to the Senate to fill out a couple years of late Senator John McCain's term. And the Democrat who looks like she's going to face in November has been raising a crazy amount of money. He has outraised her for the last 5 consecutive quarters. He has more than double cash on hand, and that is Democrat Mark Kelly. He's a former astronaut, and you might remember he is also married to former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. So even though Trump carried Arizona, it's also in 2016, it also looks like it could be a presidential battleground as well. So Arizona will definitely be a key state to watch in November. So for the next couple senators, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who covers those states.
Thank you, Bridget. So at number 4, we have Tom Tillis, who's a Republican from North Carolina. Nathan rates that race as purely a toss-up. The sort of fundraising in that race has been that the Democrat Cal Cunningham, who recently won a primary, in the first quarter, he outraised Tillis, although Tillis, like most incumbents, has more cash on hand. That's just going to be a really tight race. The polling has kind of been essentially neck and neck. Some polls have Tillis up a little bit. Some polls have had Cunningham up. Cunningham is a military veteran, so it kind of has a more moderate persona. And, Tillis, amid the coronavirus pandemic, has been fairly supportive of the state's Democratic governor, the measures that Governor Cooper has put in place there. So it kind of shows, I think, how that is factoring in. In terms of the next slot, we have Susan Collins at number 5, the longtime Maine Republican. That's a really interesting race because it speaks to sort of just this huge reversal of political fortunes for Senator Collins up there in Maine. She's had this long time reputation as, an independent does her own thing, very Maine. She won in 2014 by 37 points. And now that race, Nathan has that also as a toss-up. The likely Democratic opponent that she's going to face, Sarah Gideon, who's the state House Speaker, has raised more money in the first quarter than Collins. Collins was not where Senate Republicans and those who are watching this race wanted to see her. Now she has political longevity. She has won, numerous races and is a obviously solid brand in Maine, but this is a real race to watch. And it kind of shows the tight spot that a Republican like Senator Collins is in, sort of navigating the Trump era, trying to keep that independent-minded, reputation and persona, while not being seen as sort of taking on President Trump. She voted for the confirmation of his controversial Supreme Court nominee, who is now Justice Kavanaugh. So she has, really had to sort of navigate this, and based on current polling and the situation there, has a really tough race ahead of her. Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you for number 6.
Yeah, number 6 is another interesting one. It's Kelly Lafleur in Georgia. There are 2 Senate races in Georgia this cycle. And in our last list, it was the other seat that made it. It was Senator David Perdue, who's also a Republican. Kelly Lafleur's a Republican too. Georgia is a state that Democrats see kind of turning their way in 2020. So they are targeting both of these seats. But Kelly Lafleur is an interesting one because she was appointed in, I think it was in January, to fill the open seat left by Johnny Isakson after he retired for health reasons. And she was appointed by the Republican governor, Brian Kemp, who defied President Trump's wishes, partly because he thought Kelly Lafleur would be able to appeal to suburban female voters who they had lost in the 2016 in 2016, and also, or since 2016, sorry, and also that she's very wealthy. But that kind of has backfired a little bit recently after the coronavirus pandemic struck, when it came out that Lafleur was among a handful of senators who offloaded a bunch of stocks after getting senators only information about the pandemic back in, I think it was January when they got those briefings, or March. So since that news has come out, it's been pretty tough haul for her. It's been a big story in local media in Georgia. It's been one of the only things to break through other than coronavirus pandemic. People are pretty upset about it. So there's a big question about how that's going to play out for her in November. She does have a lot of money. She has a lot of ability to pay for advertisements that could potentially recover from it. It's also a weird race because of the way Georgia does these elections. Everybody is on the ballot, and there are a lot of Democrats in the race. There's also Trump's, the Republican who Trump had favored originally for this seat is Doug Collins, who's a House member who was a big advocate for Trump during the impeachment hearings. And he has released some polling that shows that this has helped him a little bit. The big question is whether with so many people on the ballot, it's going to probably go to a runoff with the top 2 vote getters appearing on the ballot in January. But it's a big question whether Lafleur is going to make it to one of those final 2 spots.
Great. Yeah. So we have at number 7, we have incumbent Senator Gary Peters, who's a Democrat from Michigan. This race, he's actually had record fundraising for him. So it indicates that he's been taking this race really seriously. And, you know, he still has been outraised, though, by the most likely Republican challenger, Army veteran John James, who lost a Senate race 2 years ago to Senator Stabenow in Michigan as well. You know, it's Nathan has it rated lean Democratic, so Peters has the edge. He's an incumbent. But we looked at Michigan as being a really likely pivotal battleground state. There's just going to be a lot of money that comes pouring into Michigan for the presidential race, as well as this Senate race. There aren't a lot of opportunities for Republicans to pick up a Senate seat. And even though this might be harder than most Republicans would probably like, it is an opportunity for Republicans to pick up a Senate seat. And so the likely opponent, John James, has been raising a ton of money, outraising Peters. So it's a race to watch. You know, we may reevaluate it closer to the election, but for now, he's on at number 7. Number 8 is a new addition, Steve Daines, a Republican from Montana, who was not on the radar as having a tough race until early March, when Governor Steve Bullock jumped into the race. Now, Bullock was another one of those like Hickenlooper who ran for the Democratic presidential nomination. It was unsuccessful, but he decided to throw his hat in to the Senate race, which just totally shifted the landscape and made it really a potentially pivotal race in terms of which party is going to control the Senate next year. Nathan still has that race as lean Republican, so giving Daines the edge, but it's early. And Bullock is very high profile in the state right now, managing the state's coronavirus response, which obviously can be an advantage, but also a disadvantage depending on how things go in the state with businesses and reopening the economy. So again, that's one to watch that really wasn't on our radar in 6 months ago. So Bridget, I think you're going to take number 9.
That's right. So at number 9, we have Republican Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa. Iowa obviously gets a ton of attention for the presidential race and the caucuses, but it's a really interesting state politically, and it's definitely going to be one to watch in November, in part because of this very competitive Senate race that Senator Ernst is going to be facing. Super PACs on both sides are already planning to spend millions of dollars in Iowa, which tells you that they see it as really competitive too. It's one of those seats that, so also as a reminder, Democrats need a net gain of 3 seats to flip the Senate, or 4 seats to flip the Senate, or 3 if they win the White House. So Iowa's one of those kind of on the outer edge that if they flip that might be a good sign that they could retake the Senate. So Democrats believe that they have a pretty strong candidate here. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee has backed real estate executive Teresa Greenfield in this race. She is facing a primary though, and that's coming up really quickly on June 2nd. So we'll be watching to see how she gets through that primary, and now that she can turn to November. And then, so for our last spot on the list, I'm going to throw it back to Kate for number 10.
Thank you. So this is another example of somebody who's vulnerable, at risk of losing, but the Senate seat itself isn't likely to flip parties. This is Senator Edward Markey, who's an incumbent senator. He's being challenged by Congressman Joe Kennedy III. This is Massachusetts, so the Kennedy name has a lot of, gravitas. And the early polling right after Kennedy jumped in was strongly for Kennedy. Now, some of those polls have tightened. The latest poll that I saw last week had Kennedy still ahead. Kennedy last week launched his first TV ad, and he has outraised Markey, in a considerable way. He has more money in the bank right now. So that's definitely a race that we're watching. The primary is September 1st, scheduled for September 1st in Massachusetts. We don't know how the voting might change because of the coronavirus pandemic, but that is one of those situations where Democrats are going to hold this Senate seat in November, almost certainly, but it might be that Markey does not make it out of the primary.
Okay, thanks, Kate. And that's something we'd like to make clear, is that what we're doing is we're looking at incumbents and whether they're vulnerable. There are a lot of seats that may also be in play, open seats, that are going to be much more competitive as well. But there we don't have an incumbent that we're watching. And we have some members on our House list that it's another thing where the member itself may be knocked out, but we don't think the seat is going to change parties. But Stephanie, why don't you take us through the top of the House list and talk about who dropped off the list, and then take us through the first couple of most vulnerable members.
Sure. The House list, a lot of members that were on there back when we did this list in November are still there. There are a couple of changes. One that I'll get into a little bit later is Denver Riggleman, who is in kind of a tough situation with an inter-party or intra-party challenge in his Virginia district. And then we moved some people around. A lot of the districts that we're looking at are kind of predictably districts where Democrats won in 2018 in areas where Trump won the presidential election in 2016, a couple of Republicans in districts that Hillary Clinton won. But topping the list at number 1 is Kendra Horn, and she's one that both Republicans and Democrats have said, you know, they would not have any argument at all if she was at the top of the list, just because of where she is geographically. She's in a suburban district outside of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma's 5th district. It's a district that's been represented by a Republican since mid-1970s. And she kind of came out of nowhere in 2018 to win her race. Nobody was really paying much attention to that one. And then all of a sudden she won, but just by 1 percentage point. Trump won that district in 2016 by 14 points. Democrats say that it is a suburban district. It's a suburban Oklahoma City. It's one that people discount because it's in Oklahoma, but they say that it does have a lot of the characteristics that have been good for them in other regions. There's a growing Hispanic population. There's just changing economy there that could favor her. She also has been doing a good job, the Democrats say, on local media, talking about stuff that she's doing for her constituents, really playing up her positions on education, which is big in Oklahoma, where they've had a lot of cuts to public education recently. The Republicans there do also have a primary, so it's not clear who's going to be her opponent. But that could also play against her because the 2 top fundraisers in that race are women. So they could appeal to that female suburban demographic that Democrats are hoping will go their way. Number 2, similar dynamics there. It's Xochitl Torres Small, who's in New Mexico's 2nd district. It's a little bit of a more rural district. I had trouble saying that word. So you could say that could be a little bit more of a problem for her. Also, a district that went for Trump by 10 points in 2016. She won her 2018 race by a 2 percentage point margin. Democrats say that she is somebody who is just a great fit for that area. She's a water rights attorney. She, in her 2018 campaign, had ads that showed her walking around with a hunting rifle, which is something that plays pretty well there. Also, another dynamic there that's going to be kind of interesting to watch is the primary there has gotten pretty personal pretty quickly. The two of the women who are running in that race have been attacking each other quite a bit, including in an ad that Nathan wrote about and said that it was one of the most sexist ads he'd seen in recent memory, where she was making fun of the one candidate, Yvette Herrell, who ran against Torres Small in 2018, was making fun of the other female Republican's voice. And then recently, Claire Chase has been calling for Herrell to drop out of the race after news reports that she was trying to spread rumors about Claire Chase's her former marriage. So that's one that could get kind of interesting pretty fast. So we'll be keeping our eye on that one. Number 3, similar dynamics there. This is something that you're probably going to hear from us a lot. Joe Cunningham, South Carolina, in the 1st district. Trump won that one by 11 points in 2016. Cunningham won by 1 point in 2018. Nathan rates it as a toss-up. Joe Cunningham is somebody who is pretty popular in his district. Everybody says that he's well-liked, and something that people say on both sides. But it's just a tough district to carry for any Democrat. So we'll be watching that one to see how that develops. Moving on. Number 4, this one's kind of the oddball race in our rankings. It's Denver Riggleman in Virginia's 5th. This is one that we've been watching for a while. Riggleman is a Republican in a district that Democrats have been trying to target for a while. It's one that it's just such a big district. It has a lot of suburban areas, but it also has some very rural areas. And it's just been a little bit outside of Democrats' reach. But Riggleman kind of benefited in 2018 of some last minute changes on the ticket for Republicans when their nominee dropped out of the race after he came out as an alcoholic and said he couldn't run. Riggleman won in a last minute convention by a couple of votes, but he was kind of unknown there, and some people in the local committee weren't very happy with him. He's more of a libertarian. He's a business owner. He owns a distillery. And then he officiated a gay wedding last summer, which got some people pretty upset. And then things got pretty tough for him when the local Republican Party committee decided that they were going to choose their 2020 nominee in a convention instead of in a primary, which gives a lot more control to the people on the committee who haven't been very happy with him. That's a decision that Riggleman did not like at all. He really wanted to go to a primary where more voters would be involved. He would have a much bigger edge as the incumbent, but that didn't go his way. And then now with the coronavirus pandemic, the convention plans were up in the air because Virginia's statewide stay-at-home order. Riggleman's been pushing to have the primary, to have it moved to a primary because of that. Looks like he just lost that battle this week. The committee just announced that they're going to do a drive-in primary in the parking lot of the church of the other Republican candidate, who Riggleman is now accusing of buying votes of members of the committee. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch, and we'll find out. It looks like in early June 13th is when the new committee is scheduled.
That's right.
Okay, Bridget, you got number 5, right?
Yes, I do. So nope, probably not surprised. You might have picked up on a trend here. We've got a lot of Democrats who are in Trump districts. For Republicans who are trying to flip the House, their path to the majority runs through a lot of these districts. Their theory is that there are Trump supporters who didn't turn out in 2018, who are going to turn out in 2020, and that those folks are likely to vote for Republicans for Congress too. So on number 5, we have the freshman who flipped the Trumpiest district in 2018, and that's Democrat Anthony Brindisi from upstate New York. Trump carried this district by 15 points, which is a pretty big margin, but Brindisi still managed to win. He defeated a former Congresswoman, Claudia Tenney, who is actually running again, which also gives Democrats some hope that they could hold on to this seat because he's already proven that he can beat the Congresswoman. But again, still a pretty Trump-heavy district, so we'll see how that plays out. But Congressman Brindisi has been raising a good amount of money. Democrats feel confident that he has a strong local brand. He was a former state assemblyman before coming to Congress, won a tough district there as well. And that's a kind of theme that we heard through for a lot of these Democrats, that they have a financial advantage, local brand that they think they can leverage going into 2020. So that even if their district like this, Democrats are expecting this district to go to Trump again, but they're thinking that Brindisi might be able to withstand that. So yeah, I'm going to turn over to Kate for number 6.
And I'm going to break the trend here with our Republican Rodney Davis from Illinois' 13th district.
Yeah, I did not set that up well. We have a trend, and now it's totally.
The trend is over here at number 6, but it will pick back up. This is a rematch for Davis. He won by a slim margin in 2018, and so Republicans argue if he held on during that 2018 wave, then he should be good for 2020 when a lot of those Trump voters. This is a district that Trump won by about 5 points, so definitely some good signs for Davis, but he has a better funded challenger in a rematch with I'm just blanking on her name.
Betsy
Dirksen. Thank you, team, for helping me out. But so it's a rematch, and she's obviously well known in the district, and Nathan rates that a toss-up. So I will turn that back to you, Bridget, to continue on with the vulnerable Democratic trend.
So yes, at number 7 on our list is another New York Democrat. This one is Max Rose. He is from his district, is based in Staten Island, and he is one of those. Sorry. He is another one of those Democrats in a district that the president carried by double digits. And when we first did this list 6 months ago, we actually had him at number 4. So he's looking like he's in a little bit better position now. Again, another theme with all these Democratic incumbents, he's been raising a good amount of money. The New York City media market is really expensive. And he also has the advantage, he recently deployed with the National Guard to his district to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And that's something that Republicans think is going to be tough to kind of campaign against on their side. Republican leaders have signaled their preferred candidate against him is Nicole Maliotakis. And she has some proof of support in the district. When she ran for mayor recently, she carried the district. So Republicans are feeling pretty good about her. But Max Rose, if folks watching probably have heard of him or know who he is, he's a kind of blunt, straight talking congressman, and Democrats and even some Republicans acknowledge that he's a good fit for the district. All right. And so for number 8, I'm going to go back to Kate.
Number 8, we have Congressman Collin Peterson, who's a longtime incumbent. Nathan rates it a tilt Democratic seat, even though Trump won it by over 30 points. So Peterson has his own brand. He was flirting with the idea of not running for re-election, which had Democrats really concerned, because Peterson is probably the one Democrat who can hold this seat. But it is going to be a tough challenge with Trump, and this is a very, pro-Trump district. And the challenger is Michelle Fischbach, and she hasn't raised quite as much money as Republicans were hoping. So we'll see how it goes, but just given that this is a presidential election year, this is a district that went for Trump by 31 points. That sort of explains why Peterson, even though he's a longtime incumbent, why he's on the list. So I'll toss it back to you, Bridget.
So at number 9, we have another Republican, and that is Pennsylvania Republican Scott Perry. So he's on this list mainly because of Pennsylvania redistricting and because of the Democratic recruit to take him on. Folks watching, if you have memories or nightmares from Pennsylvania redrawing its lines last cycle, threw a lot of confusion into that state in the midterms. So this is only the second time that Perry is running in this newly drawn district. And when it was redrawn, it became more Democratic. So Perry had a close race in 2018, which had Democrats thinking, okay, we have a good chance here, and this is a good opportunity, especially because Perry is a member of the conservative House Freedom Caucus, and Democrats believe he doesn't really fit his new district. And Democrats recruited State Auditor Eugene DePasquale to take him on. When he ran statewide, he did win the district narrowly, so that gives Democrats, they're thinking that he has a good shot of taking down Perry as well. And then for number 10, I'm going to toss it back to Stephanie.
Number 10, Ben Mcadams is somebody who was much higher on our list back in November, and we debated whether he should stay on there at all this time around. And that's mainly because of Republicans recruiting. Ben Mcadams is a Democrat. Another district with big Trump margin, 7 points in 2016. He won in 2018 by just 0.2 points. And Nathan rates the race as a toss-up. But what Mcadams has going for him is, one, he's got a pretty high profile in that district. It's in Utah's 4th. He was the Salt Lake County mayor before coming to Congress, and is just really well known there. He's pretty popular there. And also, Republicans have had a lot of trouble fielding an opponent for him. A guy named Dan Hemmert, who was regional director for, oh no, that's Trent Christensen. He was, Dan Hemmert had some kind of connection to Mitt Romney. I'm forgetting what it was. He dropped out back in December. He was somebody that Republicans were excited about, for a long time. Now there's kind of a crowded primary. Nobody's really been able to break through. There's someone who just entered the race back in March named Trent Christensen. He's the one who was the regional director for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. But he hasn't really managed to break through yet quite in the way I think people were hoping. So, there's still time to figure out how that primary develops. Utah Republicans are kind of interesting because, they did elect Mitt Romney to the Senate last cycle. They're not necessarily Trump Republicans, so it's not really clear how they're gonna vote in 2020 with Trump at the top of the ticket. Mcadams, if he continues doing what he's doing, he might not have such a challenging race after all. And that's it.
All right, thanks guys. Bridget Bowman, Kate Ackley, Stephanie Aiken, this is our team. It makes me happy when you can't remember this stuff because I keep getting Joe Cunningham and Cal Cunningham mixed up, and you make fun of me when I do that. I just want to let everybody know again that we will be updating this list again as the election gets closer. In fact, Tuesday's race in California's 25th district may have given us somebody new to put on that list, but that's something that our next two guests, Jason and Nathan, if you want to put your cameras and microphones on, you might be able to want to talk to, but why don't you guys take it on from here?
Thanks, Herb, and thank you very much for the plug for Political Theater. You're a frequent guest, as are the rest of Team Politics as well. Thanks for the great presentation on the most vulnerable lists. I know it's something I think a lot of people fear being on, but it's just an analysis and a guide, and we hope that it's helpful to our readers. Thanks, Herb.
They can use Jason. They can use this list for fundraising. So there's a benefit to getting on it. You don't want to be too far up the list, but it's okay to be good to be down some.
Well, Nathan, that's just an absolutely perfect transition. I couldn't have done it any better myself. Again, once again, if you're just tuning in, my name is Jason Dick. I'm the deputy editor at CQ Roll Call and the host of our Political Theater podcast. Nathan Gonzalez is Roll Call's elections analyst and also the publisher of Inside Elections. And he's, as you can see, he's getting ready to go out to a formal ball.
I'm dressed like if I was doing Political Theater podcast. I just want to give people a behind the scenes look at really what's happening.
Gotcha. Well, so we are, we're slightly within, 6 months of the general election. It certainly looks a lot different than what we were talking about 9 months out and 12 months out. We're still figuring out what campaigning is going to look like, whether there will be conventions, what turnout is going to look like. I mean, we got some interesting sort of results in the last. Just last night or Tuesday night from California and Wisconsin, the special elections there, turnout was kind of high. So what are you? How have you been able to sort of keep up just with not just the variables of a normal election, but just as we're starting to get into the stretch run here in the middle of a pandemic? Like, what are the most important things you're going to look for, Nathan, as the election gets closer?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to stay focused on the data. There are news events that will happen. Obviously, there's a news event that is every day going on that's affecting all of our lives. But to me, I think it's, someone who's handicapping races and trying to figure out what's going on, we should still stay laser focused on individual states and individual districts where these races were happening. There's going to be a temptation to look at the national polls and how is Trump versus Biden doing nationally, but we don't have a national election for president. We certainly don't have a national election for Congress. And that's why in all of these districts and states that were mentioned on the Senate side, it's important to remember, what does the polling tell us over the next 6 months in these individual races? These lists are a good reminder to me, though, of why I do ratings, not rankings. And as being a part of these discussions, trying to figure out sort of splitting hairs between some of these incumbents and where they stand in vulnerability, when in the end, all of them could lose or all of them could win together. I'm not sure how much how much of that matters, but also that these lists are dynamic. If this list had come out 2 weeks previously on the House side, Justin Amash would have been, I would have argued for him to be at the top of the list, running for re-election as an independent in Michigan. And at the same time, if this list were to come out in a couple of weeks when new Congressman Mike Garcia in California's 25th is sworn in, he would be near the top of the list. And so that is, there's a dynamic aspect to this as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have been just really kind of blown away by is we have all these concerns about the safety of in-person voting. And yet we're seeing, and so we've seen some states scramble to get absentee ballots to voters, as well as mail-in ballots and so forth. And for a special election like the California 25th special election, it looks like their turnout was on a par with the primary in March, which is astounding for any kind of special election. I mean, and do you think this is an indication that interest in this is going to keep holding, and that we may see a record turnout?
Well, that's been the prediction that I have been holding on to this entire cycle. Amidst any uncertainty, I have been certain that there would be record turnout, because voters and Americans are engaged in this election for different reasons. Some because they love the president, some because they hate the president, or they realize that there's a lot of races beyond president that matter. But the coronavirus obviously is a unknown, and it is. I think though that the enthusiasm, voters will find a way to express their opinion at the ballot box. But California, it kind of deceived us a little bit, California 25, because it should have been a reminder that we may not know on election night in November who wins, because ballots may not have even been received by the Tuesday in November when we're electing, let alone be counted. But because Mike Garcia's margin was so wide, it kind of left some of the suspense out of it. And it wasn't really a good dress rehearsal for November, when I think it legitimately could be days or even a couple of weeks before we have clarity, maybe on the presidential race, or clarity in the fight for the Senate, because so many races might be close and ballots are going to be counted for well beyond election day.
And I do want to emphasize, too, just your point that, the news cycle, obviously is very focused on the pandemic right now. And, some people may not feel that politics is exactly what they want to be tuning into, whether it's their local Senate race or the presidential race or local House race. But we've seen, as you mentioned, some people go to the polls. Some people are going to be motivated to go to the polls because they want to support the president. Some people are going to be motivated to go to the polls because the president is someone they loathe. And the president seems to embrace that. I mean, he's up in Allentown, Pennsylvania, as we speak, at sort of it's what's billed as an official event at a factory, but it's, he's dumping on Joe Biden right now. So this is really kind of a campaign event. Do you see anything changing the polling numbers for the president? Because it just seems like they're right where they were a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. They don't seem to budge.
Yeah, remarkably static amidst all of the craziness and all of the, I guess, uncertainty. The opinion around the president hasn't really changed all that much. And that's why anytime anything happens or he says something or tweets something, I'm just skeptical that it's really changing anyone's opinion. And his standing will have an effect on these two lists that the team just went through, because in multiple races, we talked about how Republican challengers are underfunded compared to Democratic incumbents. Well, one thing that can compensate for that is if the president improves his standing. If the president at the top of the ballot is doing better than what he is now and is looking like he's going to get reelected, then that could compensate for a fundraising or a spending deficit by these Republican challengers. But if he, on the reverse, if he is about where he is now or suffers a little bit in key districts, then it's going to be tough for these Republican challengers or Republican candidates to climb out of it. Let's take Cory Gardner in Colorado, for example. I think the president lost Colorado by 6 points in 2016. Does he do that again, or does he lose by 10 points? I don't think Senator Gardner can overcome a 10-point margin. And the same goes for these Democratic freshmen in the House. If the president wins those districts again, by what margin do they need to overperform Joe Biden?
And one thing that I think is lost in this too, sometimes is when we're talking about turnout and we're talking about like how these things are trending, is that candidates do still matter, and a good candidate can push into areas where they wouldn't necessarily in a close race. But we don't even know how that's going to be affected, because we don't know how much these people are going to be able to. I mean, if they're a good retail politician, they're not going to be spending a lot of time shaking hands and kissing babies in diners and like that. So, but if they're, on the other hand, if where they really are strong is somebody who reaches out digitally or social media, that could be different. So I don't envy you or the rest of the team in trying to figure out how to factor all that in, because it's just a crazy variable to try to keep track of.
We need a new term, like who's the best Zoom politician, who's the best digital politician, and maybe that's going to end up mattering, at least in this election. Mm-hmm. Which candidate can come across as a normal or likable or candidate across these different mediums. We know that we see that happening in TV ads, and who can, where a consultant maybe can craft the image of the candidate, but when you're live or doing something taped via Zoom or some other platform, what does that candidate look like? And, just going back to the most recent election in California 25, one of the gaffes of the race, Christy Smith, the Democratic Assemblywoman who lost, had a gaffe on downplaying Garcia's military experience. And, I guess we're probably going to have more of those when we're talking about dozens of races around the country over the next 6 months.
Well, before we go, Nathan, I just, I was curious, what, if you were able to parachute into a state Senate race or a House race, what would be the one that you think would tell you the most about where we are right now, if you could visit that safely, of course? Well,
starting on week 9 of quarantined in an apartment with 4 kids, I thought I would choose a district with a beach or something. So, but then you change the parameters.
Or an insane asylum, perhaps.
You change the parameters a little bit. Man, it's tough. It's like choosing between my children. If I'm choosing between an individual race, I feel like Michigan is a state to watch. Mm-hmm. It was close in 2016 at the presidential level, and Republicans are extremely excited about John James, the Republican candidate against Peters. I feel like if Michigan ends up, if Peters wins, or let's put it this way, if James wins, and that probably means the president is winning Michigan, that means we have another very close race for president once again. Control of the Senate is up for grabs, but also what do some of those suburban House districts look like? Alyssa Slotkin in the 8th district and Haley Stevens in the 11th district, where Republicans have struggled to get quality challengers. Do those come online more than they are now because of the president has improved his standing? I think that's one key place, but I don't know, going to Michigan in November, that also doesn't sound very fun. So,
it's beautiful that time of year, Nathan.
Maybe I should choose Joe Cunningham's district in South Carolina. That sounds much, that might be a better choice.
Well, Nathan, thanks so much for, talking about this. It's just going to get more interesting, I think, as we get closer to the election. I appreciate your insights, as always.
No problem.
And I think, that is going to be it for us here. I really appreciate everybody joining the webinar. I know it's a busy time. It's a uncertain time, but thank you for allowing us to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned, and we're going to keep learning in this. And so we are going to sign off. Please enjoy your day, and please again subscribe to At the Races, check rollcall.com, and tune into our podcasts and our work. Thanks again, everybody.